All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Nelson, and on behalf of ISI Books, the publishing imprint of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and Borders Books and Music of Wilmington, Delaware, I want to welcome you this afternoon to this afternoon's talk by author and professor E. Christian Koff. That welcome extends beyond those of you gathered physically here with us at Borders to an electronic audience of countless others, thanks to the good offices of C-SPAN 2's Book TV. I also want to thank Marcy Resnick of Borders Books and Music for helping to make this event possible for us. And I especially want to thank the Wilmington-based Curran Foundation, especially its trustees Bill Speakman, James Stewart, and Charles Maddock, for making it possible for ISI to bring national figures, such as our guest, to Wilmington for the benefit of the community at large. For those of you who don't know about ISI, ISI is a local nonprofit educational foundation whose purpose, since its founding in 1953, is to convey to successive generations of college youth a better understanding of the values and institutions that shape and sustain America's tradition of ordered liberty. ISI works principally in the vineyard of higher education. It has over 50,000 members in every state and active representation at nearly half of all American colleges and universities. ISI Books was launched several years ago and has published books by such luminaries as Richard Weaver, the economist Wilhelm Röpke, theologian Romano Guardini, and the political theorist Gerhard Niemeyer, and the historian Russell Kirk, as well as many others. As satisfying as this is, we've managed to acquire something of a reputation for publishing mainly dead guys. So it is with great pleasure that I'm able to refute that stereotype by introducing to you one of ISI's growing number of living authors, E. Christian Koff. Dr. Koff is, in fact, one of the liveliest, creative, and provocative thinkers in America today. He's a professor of classics at the University of Colorado in Boulder, and the author of well over 100 articles, essays, and reviews, and leading publications. His latest book is The Devil Knows Latin: Why America Needs the Classical Tradition. His is a lucid and a timely work, really. Why? Well, take, for example, a recent survey by the National Constitution Center, testing teenagers' knowledge of civics against their command of popular culture. That survey found that 12% of American teenagers knew of the town where Abraham Lincoln lived most of his life, but 73% knew the town where Bart Simpson lived, both being Springfield. One at least, Illinois. I'm not sure about Bart Simpson. It also found that only 2% knew who the father of the Constitution was, James Madison, while 90% knew who starred as the father of television's Home Improvement, Tim Allen. It found that only 21% knew how many senators there are, but 81% knew how many brothers are in the musical group Hanson. And finally, this survey found that only 2% knew who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is, but 95% knew who played the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. These are disturbing results, and they raise important questions about what role the American, and more broadly our inherited Western past, will play in shaping the next century. The Devil Knows Latin offers compelling commentary on the state of American culture and proposes remedies along the way for possible cultural renewal. And to shed some light on the Greco-Roman highway that may be our best avenue out from our present discontents, I present to you E. Christian Koff, who will speak on the topic, Why America Needs the Classical Tradition. Dr. Koff.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. And I'm a fan of both James Madison and Bart Simpson, so I hope I won't be completely devoted to one at the expense of the other. I'd like to start by telling a story that we'll talk on after that. In The Poet and the Lunatics, G.K. Chesterton's poet, Gabriel Gale, meets a brilliant scientist devoted to the cause of emancipating society from tradition and social convention. Gale and the scientist are discussing the scientist's philosophy one evening at an informal gathering with a few friends when Gale realizes the man is mad. The poet rushes everybody away from the house just before the scientist blows it sky high. Gale later explains to his bewildered friends that his suspicions were aroused by seeing 3 goldfish gasping desperately in a pool of water on the table in the library. In accordance with his philosophy, the scientists had liberated them from their bowl. The struggle between Gabriel Gale and the mad scientist represents the most important contest of our age. According to Nietzsche, archetypical modern, the man who diverges from tradition is a victim. The man who does not is a slave. Aristotle saw it differently. To live according to your country's way of life is not slavery, he wrote in his great reflections on politics. It is salvation. The divide could not be wider, and the enmity could not be more serious between those who side with Nietzsche and those who agree with Aristotle. The intellectual leaders of our age side with Nietzsche. Like Nietzsche, they feel that if they could only free themselves from the trammels of tradition in religion, science, art, and politics, true fulfillment will be theirs. For them, tradition is memorizing what others have accomplished. Fulfillment, in their eyes, comes to those who have rejected the past, the handed down, the socially constructed, in order to enter into a reality that is individualistic, innovative, and free. There is nothing innovative and free, however, in flopping around on a table in a pool of water. Tradition is not a cage. It's the goldfish bowl that keeps us alive. And it also is, in fact, an everyday reality. Everyone knows at least one tradition through personal experience. You know your own native language. Traditions we value, whether science or Christianity, are best experienced in the tongues that help form them. When Martin Luther called upon the counselors of the German cities to found and maintain Christian schools, he wanted those schools to teach languages, the sacred tongues, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. The languages are the sheath in which the sword of the Spirit is lodged, he explained. Die Sprachen sind das Scheiden, darin das Messer des Geistes steckt. Is lodged sounds so serious when you translate shtick, doesn't it? But Luther was right. Thomas Jefferson, John Stuart Mill, Albert J. Nock, men committed to the traditions of self-rule and science, insisted on instruction in the classical languages. Back in the 40s, when the Catholic Mass was still in Latin, Ronald Knox, a wise and witty Catholic priest, was asked to perform a baptism in the vernacular. He rejected the idea with what his biographer Evelyn Waugh described as uncharacteristic acerbity. I will not, he said. The baby does not understand English, and the devil knows Latin. How does tradition work? The first step is handing down the deposit. For language, the words. For science or self-government, the principles. Then comes the critical evaluation of what was learned. Both steps are necessary for a truly humane assimilation of the past. Then, but only then, some gifted spirit may achieve a creative response, a poem or a scientific discovery that continues and renews the tradition. And after that, we begin again, teaching, learning, absorbing, criticizing, creating. I once heard a college administrator who had been a lively and popular teacher in his salad days tell a group of alumni that we teachers were not very good role models. Instead of preparing students for innovation, we spend our time indoctrinating them about the past. This administrator was blind to what his success as a teacher and a scholar, now distant by many years at this point, shows that he once knew. Creativity is possible only as the final stage in a long, rigorous absorption of the teachings and discoveries of the past. The last thing we need for the future of our country, or of our young people, is one more lunatic smashing goldfish bowls in order to free the goldfish. A healthy person's life forms an Aristotelian narrative. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The story will include success as well as failure, tragedy as well as comedy, high emotion as well as bathos, but it will nonetheless possess a coherence, the variegated strains of the narrative united at the stable center of the tale, which is the person. Indeed, anyone who cannot explain how his situation today relates to his deeds of yesterday will not be able to understand the connection between the self he once was and who he is today. He'll be alienated. Each individual life, in addition, is part of larger wholes, family, profession, nation, civilization, in the midst of which the narrative of that life is lived out. The healthy individual must be able to recount not only his own story, the story of the self which he inhabits, but the narrative of each of these larger wholes in which the self finds itself. Otherwise, he'll collapse into that anomie which Durkheim described and so much of modern literature portrays. Learning to tell the stories of the larger wholes to which we belong is initially the responsibility of the family, and subsequently the responsibility of the schools too. Too often, however, today's educational system fails to lead children to a stage where they can tell the story of their nation and civilization as a coherent narrative. Traditional education was successful in this. Concentrating on Greek, Latin, and mathematics, traditional educators not only trained the minds of their students for careful reading and thinking, but they also introduced students to an enormous amount of myth, literature, and history. In other words, to the corporate side of their personal stories. Even when the details of language and computation disappeared, and they often did, the stories remained and provided the basis for meaningful lives and productive societies. Denied these stories by the present educational system, students become like the anti-heroes of modern novels, people trapped in a world they cannot understand, bit players in a drama whose basic themes remain a mystery to them. The abolition of Latin and Greek effectively severed an entire culture from the stories that constituted or should have constituted its mental infrastructure. It's little wonder many elite Americans find Franz Kafka more appealing than Samuel Johnson. Their own lives are absurd. The problem began at the close of the 19th century when people began seeking an education that would not be so time-consuming and so inaccessible to the less intelligent. The study of important texts written in challenging foreign languages was to be replaced by the reading of the same texts translated into English. In other words, the great books. Young people would read the great books as a means of getting introduced to the narrative their own lives were to continue, but without having to pay the price their elders paid. The argument for deserting the traditional Western curriculum of Greek, Latin, and mathematics was straightforward. The curriculum was too difficult for many people, perhaps for most people. The argument for deserting a curriculum based on the canon of the Western great books is also straightforward. The curriculum is inadequate and restrictive in a world united by the global influence of Western technology, which is based on Western science, and the widespread popularity of Western-style political systems. In the latter case, representative democracy is always privileged, although on the face of it, Marxist dictatorship rules just as impressive a number of people, and both develop out of the Western political tradition. I can see the argument, which I do not advocate, that the global influence of Western technology, science, and political systems implies that other cultures should give up their traditions and learn Western traditions. I can see no logic in Americans deserting Western culture at a time when they see the fruits of that culture desired all over the world. Take the example of technology. Using tools is a cultural universal. All human beings do it. It's one of the things you find wherever you find Homo sapiens. Without Western science to help them, the Egyptians built the pyramids, as impressive an accomplishment as the Apollo space program, which did depend on Western science. If the American people want to give up on aeronautics, biochemistry, and computers and build pyramids, then they need to spend less time on Western traditions and more time learning Egyptian traditions. In fact, Americans want a future with a heavy dose of the benefits of technology, science, and representative government, all the fruits of the tree of Western culture. If we want the advantages of Western culture, we need to immerse ourselves and our children in the languages, literatures, and ideas that shape that culture. Mastering the text of Lady Murasaki, let's say, is a worthwhile enterprise, as worthwhile as any other. It makes sense, however, in the context of learning Japanese culture. The same is true of serious study of the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads, or the Quran and the Arabian Nights. Studying them only makes sense as part of a serious moral and intellectual effort to enter into Indian or Islamic culture. This is not the philosophy of the new multicultural Great Books curriculum, which is modeled on the ideal of wandering down the aisles of a contemporary supermarket, free to choose ad libitum, ad infinitum, and finally, ad nauseum. Perhaps the model is going out to dine in a large city or a university town. One night we go to the Italian restaurant, the next night to a Japanese restaurant, and the next night to an Indian restaurant. Whether such a confused diet is good for the health, I leave to others. But I suspect that the more authentic the food is, the less digestible such a diet will prove. I'm quite sure that in the life of the mind and the soul, a diet of Dante one day, Lady Murasaki the next, and the Mahabharata after that, will prove not only indigestible, but poisonous. The new multicultural Great Books curriculum is not only intellectually incoherent, it is culturally incoherent. It prepares the student to participate in no one culture. It leaves the victim of such a curriculum on the outside of every culture, hungry and cold, with his nose pressed against the window, staring enviously and impotently at the riches within. Whether you are to become a Brahmin, a samurai, or a scientist, the initiation is long and difficult. The same is true for kshatriya, or citizen. The first step in all these cases is learning the culture that provides the soil in which these different visions of human fulfillment grew. It's for this reason that those who dwell in the West must first turn to the traditions of the West. You may be able to buy the ingredients at the multicultural supermarket, but you cannot learn the art of preparing a nourishing meal. That art, like all art, is a discipline rooted in a specific culture. Students, we all agree, need a practical education. The most practical of all subjects is the study of Latin. One reason to study this dead language is to learn the vocabulary of English. True, of the 100 most commonly used words in English, only a dozen or so come from Latin. Of all English words, however, over 1 million in the latest dictionaries, more than half are of Latin origin, and those of Greek origin take up much of what remains. In the third edition of Bright's Old English Grammar and Reader, edited by Frederick G. Cassidy and Richard N. Ringler, the editors wanted to make a point about the history of English. In sum, they said, it should be evident that there is a considerable degree of continuity in the core of the English vocabulary between Old English times and the present. And to make this point, they printed the sentence I just read with the words of Latin origin left out, and pointed out that 75% of the words were still there. They were English words. Let me read to you that sentence with the Latin words left out. In blank, it should be blank, that there is a blank of blank in the blank of the English blank between Old English times and blank. Just hearing to it shows you that the sentence is incomprehensible without the Latin-derived words. The structural skeleton of most English sentences, 3/4 of them, Cassidy and Ringler are quite correct, consists of articles, prepositions, and forms of the verb to be, which come from Old English. But the meaning of the sentence, the flesh and blood of its body and its muscle, come from the Latin words. Without the Latin words, that sentence is a frame with no picture. Using only the Latin words, you could eventually puzzle out the author's intention. Sound a little bit like Tonto in the old Lone Ranger episodes, but you could still finally figure it out. Cassidy and Ringler's own examples show that in serious discourse in English, it's the words of Latin origin that carry the meaning. Now, English is a form of German. How did it come about that a coherent linguistic system, when it wants to talk seriously about law, medicine, religion, ethics, uses the words of another language? There is a story behind it, and I like to call that story the Latin invasions of English. Julius Caesar tried to invade Britain twice in the 50s of the last century BC. His own account of those invasions is so brilliant and so exciting, few readers notice that 2 invasions followed by 2 withdrawals represent defeat, not victory. It was 100 years before another Roman tried to conquer Britain, and then it was the Emperor Claudius. Claudius was not an impressive figure. He limped when he talked. He stuttered. Worst of all, he was an ancient historian, author of a history of the Etruscans. Despite the support of the Praetorian Guard, his administration seemed doomed. Then he had a brainstorm. One reason to study the classical past is to learn practical lessons for your present and your future. Someday, you may be the leader of a nation, a prime minister or president, and your popularity may sink in the polls. If you do, follow Claudius's example. Invade and conquer a small island. The examples of Lady Margaret Thatcher and President Ronald Reagan show this is still an effective way to win lasting popularity. The fates of President George Bush and Prime Minister John Major indicate that participating in the invasion of small nations situated on the mainland does not engender the same popular affection. I can't explain why. Claudius did not know the Falklands or of Grenada, neither of which had been discovered in his day, but from the writings of his ancestor, Julius Caesar, he had heard of Britain. The British king, whose name survives in our literature as Shakespeare's Cymbeline, had just died, and his sons were fighting over the succession. The Roman army took advantage of the situation to land in Britain and win some skirmishes. Claudius showed up in time to take credit for the victory, and then he returned to Rome as conquering hero, held a triumph, named his son Britannicus, never again had to fear lack of popularity. His wives' intriguing was something else. Now, Latin-speaking Britain was a wealthy and happy province. Roman villas spread throughout the land. Old cities prospered, and new foundations, such as Londinium, if you can recognize what that is, sprang up and grew. The future Emperor Constantine, who hastened the Roman Empire on the road to Christianity, spent much of his youth there. Eventually, however, the Roman Empire fell on evil days. Constantine's reforms led to a long life for much of the empire. In the East, it survived until 1453 AD. But some limbs had to be amputated to preserve the health of the body. One of those limbs was Britain. Roman troops were withdrawn in the early 5th century AD, and before long, German tribes began landing on Britain's shores. The Latin-speaking Celts fought back, but eventually the Germans won, and Britain became England, the land of the German-speaking Angles and Saxons. Our beer-swilling, venison-munching ancestors didn't know much Latin, few words. They had noticed the great Roman roads, strata, and that's where our word street eventually comes from. Like many Latin words, strata was picked up by scientists in the 19th century, and so it survives twice in English. Such doublets are far from rare. A good parallel is the chivalrous medieval word feet and the cold 19th century word fact, both descendants of Latin factum. Likewise, in their wanderings through Europe before reaching Britain, the Angles and Saxons could hardly have failed to notice the great Roman fortifications. Wall is the first half of the Latin word wallum. They saw the Romans drinking wine, eating cheese, and two important English words, straight from Latin, vinum and casius, were born. Casius, like strata, has suffered through our inability to pronounce vowels purely, a defect we inherited from our Anglo-Saxon ancestors. So we say cheese, which isn't quite right, but on the other hand, the W of wine preserves the correct Latin pronunciation of the first sound in vinum, long after the Romance descendants of Latin twisted the pronunciation to V, vin, vino. After the conversion of the Germans, more Latin words came in from Christianity, including candle and altar and other religious terms. In 1066, the Angles and Saxons themselves were conquered by a new set of barbarians, the Normans of France. Even when the French are conquered by barbarians, they still make them learn French. They don't learn their language, and so the Normans spoke French. The conquering Normans imported a whole slew of Latin words, modified by their transition through late Latin into French. The new words were part of the language of the conquerors, and Latin became associated with rulers. So while the peasant works with his hands, which is a good German word, the aristocrat took that work and used it to get food for his stomach, a Latin word. Similarly, those filthy animals the Saxons herded for their rulers were swine, German word, but the delicious food which the aristocrats ate was pork, the Latin word. Latin still suffers from the feeling people have that it's the language of an oppressive elite, a medieval notion. The 16th century brought the Renaissance, the Reformation, new inventions, new continents, new ideas. All these new things cried out to be labeled with new words, and of course, important writers in English made a very significant decision. Instead of trying to weld together new sounds to signify all these new discoveries, these writers turned their back on the present and sought in the rich and sophisticated world of antiquity old words to describe new things and new events. A few examples out of a cornucopia of possibilities. How do you describe the feeling things are getting better? When your world is a unified whole, where classes and doctrines do not change, you don't need such a concept. But people in the 16th century felt there had been emendation. So they picked up a Latin word for travel, progress. The Middle Ages used the noun progress to describe the passage of the king from one noble house to another. Fortunately, modern politicians don't tax us that way. 16th century Englishmen, though, used it to describe things not just going, but going somewhere. Soon the noun progress was being used as a verb, to progress, even by William Shakespeare. Before long, an adjective would develop, progressive, which appealed to Francis Bacon. Then, for a variety of reasons, progress faded away from common use in England. In the 19th century, however, the word began to be used again, especially in the United States. And once we started using it, the rest of the world started again. Here's one more example. How do you describe the feeling that you're getting older, but also better? Sir Thomas Elyot, T.S. Eliot's ancestor, wrote a book on education called The Book Named the Governor. While writing it, he felt the need of a word to express exactly that thought. He considered using the word ripe from the plant world, but Some vague linguistic instinct told him that older people would not want to be called ripe. So he turned to the Latin word for ripe, maturus, reserving, as he said, the words ripe and ready to fruit and other things. People who got better as they got older were mature, and their condition was maturity. Aging baby boomers can be grateful for the thoughtful Eliot and hundreds of other writers who in the 16th and 17th century coined thousands of new English words out of old Latin and Greek ones. Now, all these words did not survive, but many did, enriching our speech and allowing the genius of our language to mature, to progress in an orderly fashion. The phenomenon of turning to antiquity for very old words to label new things happened again in Western history in the 19th and 20th centuries. That age turned to ancient Greece and Rome for the words to describe locomotive, airplane, sociology, and hermeneutics, and the process is still going on as the 21st century dawns. We're all talking about computers nowadays, but the word comes out of Latin, computo, I reckon. By the way, compute and count is another one of those doublets, like feet and fact. The little flashing marker that blinked at me as I wrote the first draft of this is called a cursor, another good Latin word for runner. Latin not only gives to those who study it the words to talk about law and medicine, theology and morality, not only introduces them to really interesting thinkers like Cicero and Virgil, it also gives people the words to describe things that haven't been invented yet. Our society, unlike many others, has been able to assimilate change and newness without coming apart because we've explained development and innovation by employing the concepts and using the words drawn from tradition. It's a typically Western thing to do, and by doing it, we maintain the continuity with the past. We keep our balance. When you turn your back on tradition, you risk falling down. Without the solid foundation of our classical heritage, modern Americans can no longer use the past to keep sane in the present. Is it any wonder life so often feels like a free-fall experience? Don't look back, the great baseball pitcher Satchel Paige once said. Something might be gaining on you. Authoritative figures, from commencement speakers to presidents of the United States, tell us year after year we should face the future. Indeed, President Clinton's favorite rock and roll song enjoins us. Don't stop thinking about tomorrow. Yesterday's gone. Yesterday's gone. So it may seem incredible that anybody would suggest with a straight face that we turn our backs on the blank screen of the future and face the past, our own, our nations, and our civilizations. That's the advice this book offers. There are a number of common sense reasons for the advice. T.S. Eliot gave one in his famous essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent. Eliot said, "Someone said the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did." Precisely, said Eliot. They are what we know. C.S. Lewis pointed out in our wanderings, we discover we've taken the wrong path. The progressive thing to do is to turn around and go back to where we went astray. These mild and reasonable assertions should not ruffle any feathers. After all, Eliot's point is one of the key arguments for liberal education, and Lewis is propounding nothing but a sunset law for stupid ideas. Renewal and creativity in a host of areas, artistic, political, and religious, come from returning to the sources of the tradition, not barreling on ahead into the future. A nation lives by its myths and heroes. Many societies have survived defeat and invasion, even political and economic collapse. None has survived the corruption of its picture of itself. This is where high and popular art are not in competition. Both help citizens decide what they are, who they are, and what they are to admire. In our age, however, high art has given up speaking to the body of its fellow citizens. It devotes itself to technical displays that can appeal only to other technicians. In the days of the great studios, Hollywood attempted to express a national feeling, but that effort collapsed with the decline of the studio system in the 60s. Yet the 60s did produce one filmmaker committed to films that both succeed as popular entertainment, but also speak to the whole American people. Clint Eastwood's famous chipped tooth and limited acting range had slowed his career until he was cast as Rowdy Yates in the television series Rawhide. His youthful good looks and sullen passion won the hearts of the teenagers who were becoming the largest segment of the population in those days. Based on the success, Eastwood's agent got him a part in a European movie, a Western, with an Italian director, an Italian villain. A quarter of a century later, that villain, Gian Maria Volonté, was considered, when he died, one of Italy's premier actors. And the director, Sergio Leone, is still admired and honored as the creator of one of the most popular subgenres in film history, the spaghetti Western. It's an education to watch Leone begin with A Fistful of Dollars, Per un pugno di dollari, in 1964. Hit his stride the next year for a few dollars more, per qualche dollaro in più, and then go on to create The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Il buono, il brutto, il cattivo, 1967. The original trilogy is slow-paced but tense with excitement, superficially immoral but in fact deeply ethical. Above all, it has Clint Eastwood. The men and the hour had met. What Leone was doing needed Eastwood's strength and could bypass his weakness. He needed a strong screen presence that was tough, had a sense of humor, remained sympathetic, and Eastwood did not need to talk very much. Critics scorned the film, and Italian Marxists explained it was all a conspiracy by the Christian Democratic Party of Catholics to make Italians forget about their economic troubles that followed the great economic miracle of the 50s. Ordinary people, however, flocked to see them, and Eastwood's screen persona was born, created by Leone's genius and Eastwood's own squinting charisma. The late 60s, however, was not a good time for either man. Eastwood was cast in a number of westerns, watchable now only because they include him. The Nadir was the catastrophic Paint Your Wagon of 1969, a musical western that combined appalling immorality with unbelievably bad singing. Eastwood's walk through a forest singing I Talk to the Trees may be the musical low point of a decade that listened to Herman's Hermits. The waste of money appalled Eastwood as much as the aimlessness of his career, and he finally founded Malpeso Productions so he could produce his own movies with artistic control. The critical world howled with laughter at that proviso. But in fact, Eastwood proceeded to make a series of successful movies, sexy teasers like Play Misty for Me in 1971, cop movies and westerns. It was the second type that won him the most enduring fame and alienated the Hollywood elite. After more than 2 decades, we can see that Dirty Harry in 1971 was a film masterpiece, the most influential work of popular art since Uncle Tom's Cabin. Director Don Siegel is a very different figure from Sergio Leone, but the Italian's vision of the American West can be felt in the film's ethical tensions. Eastwood's own westerns were made in the Leone mold. In fact, as the Italian's later movies became increasingly bizarre and out of touch with popular feeling, Eastwood's westerns were the true continuation of Leone's project. In these movies, as in For a Few Dollars More, an act of immorality is avenged after a long time by a tough but honest hero. Even so, The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1976 came as a surprise. Based on real incidents, the massacre of surrendering Confederate soldiers by Union armies at the end of the Civil War, The Outlaw Josie Wales has a title dripping irony. Wales has lost his family to Yankee raiders during the war, a fact Eastwood brings home to the viewer by means of staccato flashbacks deployed with a power and control that he has really not been able to recover. He refuses to ride down out of the hills to surrender, which means he witnesses the massacre of the Confederates at the hands of the treacherous Yankees. Wales charges and rescues one friend. That is why he's an outlaw. Fleeing his relentless pursuers, he gathers around him a motley family of those who'd suffered from the Union, including one Indian and some women who've lost their husbands and fathers. He finally establishes a new homestead and turns to face his tormentors. Directed with restraint and considerable humor, Josie Wales is now recognized as one of Eastwood's best movies, but he has been forgiven for as little as for Dirty Harry. There's no clearer statement that in America, ordinary people can create a community without giving in to history's victors. The picture of a true community that survives and prospers while at odds with the official society is found again in Bronco Billy in 1980. Eastwood's most successful comedy and yet a serious film. Bronco Billy's Wild West Show is Eastwood's vision of America. In one sense, it's a weird congeries of misfits, deserters, and losers. Bronco Billy gives these people the chance to create the world they need to live in. In fact, none of the members of the show is a real cowboy or a real Indian. Not even the Indian. They're all fakes. They created their own personas as traditional American cowboys and Indians, and in the final scene, the show performs in a tent made up of American flags, sewn by lunatics. And Eastwood tells the little pards in the audience to live up to the American ideals of law and order and obedience to their parents. The affirmation of his country and its mores managed to be splendidly absurd and deeply moving at one at the same time. The French Hellenist Jean-Pierre Vernon, said of Greek tragedy that it stopped using the tragic hero as a model and treated him as a problem. The same change took place in the popular art of the 50s and 60s, most strikingly in John Ford's later masterpieces, The Searchers and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, but also in John le Carré's spy novels. Typical of the age were the scenes added to Patton to cut the general down to size when it became obvious that George C. Scott's tour de force performance had made the general too heroic. Eastwood's contribution was to show how the problematic hero could become a model again. Here, as in so many other ways, Dirty Harry is crucial. The early scenes of the movie consistently show Harry breaking the rules of sensitive, caring, liberal America. We're deep into the movie before we recognize with Harry's partner, Remy Santoni, that Harry is dirty because he's competent, and so he can be used to do the dirty jobs. Similarly, in Bronco Billy, we learn only slowly that the Wild West show is a Potemkin village for people who are not really cowboys and Indians, but shoe salesmen and deserters. It's nearly the end before we discover the creation of a new world by people fleeing from a failed old world is the definition of America. Pale Rider in 1985 is a likewise misunderstood Eastwood masterpiece. He has borrowed key scenes from important movies before, but he never attempted a complete mimesis of another movie. In Pale Rider, he remakes Shane, but with an Eastwood Avenger in the lead. Unlike High Plains Drifter in 1973, where a corrupt community is destroyed by the Avenger, in this movie, the hero's revenge saves a community of miners who's faced destruction at the hands of a corrupt and wealthy strip miner. Eastwood's admiration for Shane is easy to understand. Alan Ladd is a man without family who saves not only a community, but also an individual family in the face of cruel violence and the temptations of adultery. That the family and the community are saved by a man who's been stripped of both is a constant Eastwood theme. Dirty Harry's wife was killed in a meaningless accident with a drunk driver. Josie Wales' family was destroyed by Union raiders. Bronco Billy shot his wife when he caught her in bed with his best friend. "What did you do to him?" Sandra Locke asks. "Nothing," Billy replies. "He was my best friend." In Eastwood, the generic conventions of the Western unite with the motifs of epic. Eastwood's heroes are Virgilian. Like Virgil's Aeneas, they have been stripped of family and city in order to lead others to a new home and a new community. Josie Wales and Bronco Billy, where these motifs are clearest, are from the standpoint of art, his most successful films. These themes unite most perfectly in the final scene of Dirty Harry. Eastwood confronts an enemy whose madness, furor, will destroy society unless he is stopped, just as Aeneas confronts Turnus at the end of the Aeneid, whose furor is about to destroy Italy. The Aeneid ends with the death of Turnus. Not so Dirty Harry. Harry does dispose of the Scorpio killer, true, but he also takes out his badge, throws it away, and then slowly walks back as the camera sweeps upward to show us the hustle and bustle of the society for which Harry Callahan will no longer risk his life. The discarding of the badge and the leaving of the spineless society are a direct mimesis, imitation of the end of High Noon. They are also quite Virgilian. At some stage, the hero will turn away from weakness and corruption and devote himself to creating his own community. That community may contain elements of the absurd, as Josie Wales and Bronco Billy did. The absurdity, however, adds piquancy to man's stumbling search for honesty and honor. The hero can no longer take refuge in his situation as a problem. He must recover the harder and admittedly somewhat absurd task of becoming again a model for healthy and honest people. The legend of the West involves a frightened town, terrorized by corruption and a guilty secret. That legend also contains the promise of the frontier. It is a frontier in the human mind and will, accessible to everyone with the courage and the honesty to move out of corruption and weakness into the persona they have chosen. Honesty and courage leading to creativity are their own reward. They give meaning to an individual and to a nation. In Eastwood's films, the troubled American hero ceased to be a problem and has become again a model. The man with no name is free to choose a name from the past. Bronco Billy, Josie Wales, and we are free to do the same. How much time do I have? Keep on going? Let me talk a little bit more about movies. This is from a chapter near the end of the book called Things You See Better in the Dark. The American Film Institute, the AFI, presented its list of the 100 best American movies in 1998, just as the Modern Library published its list of 100 best novels in English. Although marketing lurked behind both maneuvers, the creation of these lists shows that even the liberal tradition of anti-traditionalism feels the need for a canon, a list of approved texts that embodies and exemplifies what the regime stands for. If the AFI had been truly loyal to liberalism's democratic ideals and plutocratic reality, it would have ranked the movies on the basis of the amount of money they had earned in steady dollars. Everybody ever paid to see a movie would have had a vote. The French actually count the number of seats sold, which is a more objective way of measuring a movie's popularity because it removes the bias of inflation. The thought of Gone with the Wind nudging past Citizen Kane and E.T. jostling ahead of Schindler's List was probably too much for Hollywood's image-conscious leadership to contemplate, so the list was, quote, selected by AFI's blue ribbon panel of more than 1,500 leaders of the American movie community, end quotes. Those are the words of the official press release. The leaders included talk show host Larry King and President Bill Clinton. I guess if you're the leader of the free world, you're also one of the leaders of the American movie community. When the list was presented on television, we got to hear various members of the panel introduce their favorite movie. President Clinton, for instance, said his favorite was High Noon, voted number 33 by the whole council. Since the president lives by the public opinion polls, some may find it hard to understand what he sees in a movie about a marshal, played by Gary Cooper, who does his duty no matter what other people do or say, even if it's to lead to his own death. They may understand the movie's appeal to the president, however, when they remember the scene where Cooper's wife, played by Grace Kelly, saves her husband's life by shooting an enemy in the back. Tragedy is an emotion and a genre foreign to Hollywood. It depends on moral conflict and not technological display. Movies that possess tragic conflict are often not very successful as works of art. John Wayne's Green Beret, Walking Tall. Their themes are Roman and not Greek. Aeneas loses his family so that he can lead his people to a new home. This story pattern is rarely found in artistically successful movies. Exceptions include some of John Ford's westerns. The AFI list included the socialist pathos of Grapes of Wrath at number 21 and the naive individualism of Stagecoach at 63, but found no room for She Wore a Yellow Ribbon or The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, although The Searchers managed to squeeze in at number 96. In the last three movies, John Wayne plays men who sacrifice home and family to fight barbarism and violence so that other Americans can live in an ordered and peaceful society. Behind the main plot, we glimpse irreplaceable loss, a family massacred, brave men dying without children, the defeat of the Confederacy. Against the leitmotif of a new society built on loss and sacrifice, there plays an ironic counterpoint the theme of the illusions which the peaceful society maintains to hide from itself the sacrifices needed for its foundations. At the end of The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, the aggressive newspaperman who is so hungry for a story at the movie's opening discovers that the violent gunslinger Liberty Valance was not killed by Jimmy Stewart, a soft-spoken Eastern lawyer who rode to political success because people believed he shot Valance in a duel. No, the man who really shot Liberty Valance was John Wayne, whose reward was to die without fame or heir. The newsman decides his professional duty is to legend, not to truth, and suppresses the story. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. The scene recalls the end of Ford's Fort Apache, where at the very end, John Wayne allows the reputation of the bigoted martinet, played by Henry Fonda in his finest performance, to remain unbesmirched by the complicated and uninspiring truth. The new country needs heroes more than it needs that kind of truth. The most famous image from a John Ford movie is the last shot in Searchers, where John Wayne walks away from the family and society he has reunited at terrible cost to himself. Like the leftist ideologue of Steinbeck's Viva Zapata, he has no country or farm, no family or wife. He didn't cast them away because he was driven by lust for power. He sacrificed his chance for them to do his duty. The Hollywood happy ending is for other people and other movies. Two places below The Searchers on the AFI list is Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven. It was the only one of his very successful movies to make the list. No movie directed by Don Siegel made the list. Not Dirty Harry, not Invasion of the Body Snatchers, not Madigan. As often with the AFI list, ideology was a key factor. Eastwood allowed Unforgiven to be marketed as a repudiation of the violent movies, which helped make him one of the pop icons of the generation that began watching him in the early 60s in Rawhide on television. And then in the movies that began with Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns and culminated in his most famous part, Dirty Harry. Unforgiven differs from other Eastwood action movies because his usual Roman themes of loss and sacrifice are elided in favor of Greek themes of human limitation and tragic error. As in Dirty Harry, the conflict is between a savage killer and an honest lawman who must use violence to repel violence and save society for law-abiding citizens. In Unforgiven, however, the notorious killer is played by Eastwood himself, and most of the movie is seen from his point of view. It's as though Dirty Harry were filmed from the perspective of Andy Robinson's Scorpio Killer, instead of Eastwood's Dirty Harry, Harry Callahan. The marshal of the small frontier town of Big Whiskey is Little Bill, played by Gene Hackman, Oscar-winning performance. He is trying and failing to build a home for himself and to make the town safe for decent people. He's honest and fair, though rough. When a whore is scarred in a cat house brawl, he arranges for what he considers fair payment. The prostitutes are not satisfied. They want revenge in blood, and they offer a large reward for anyone who kills the man who scarred their friend. These are not the innocent women at the mercy of a serial killer, whom we find in many Eastwood movies. They are the Furies of Aeschylus's Eumenides, contemptuous of compromise, interested only in a remorseless lex talionis of blood for blood. They spread a story of an innocent girl mutilated and offer an enormous reward. It's Hackman's job to stop their ruthless lust for revenge. When a feared English gunfighter, the Duke of Death, played by Richard Harris, arrives in Big Whiskey, Hackman attacks him before he has a chance to do anything. Little Bill disarms and brutalizes the dangerous killer, and then sends his broken body out of town as the women watch in impotent frustration. Then Eastwood shows up, and again, Little Bill beats him to within an inch of his life. Hackman is as brutally effective in the Old West as Dirty Harry is in today's San Francisco. Eastwood's character, William Money, is a more complicated figure than Andy Robinson's Scorpio Killer. Money stopped killing for pay under the influence of a good woman. His wife, however, died, constant motif in Eastwood movies. Left alone, he's a failure as a pig farmer. When invited by a violent young man to return once more to his old life, he decides to go along, even though, as he says over and over, I ain't like that no more. He calls upon his old sidekick, Ned, played by Morgan Freeman, to help him. Marriage and farming have also domesticated Ned, who eventually leaves Money and his young friend before their cruel and humiliating murder of the two cowboys the whores have targeted for death. Although Ned left before the killing and accepted no money, Little Bill captures him. After Ned dies under Little Bill's brutal interrogation, his corpse is displayed in the window of the bar where the whorehouse is located. When Money hears of his friend's death, he begins drinking again and goes looking for revenge, like Achilles seeking revenge for his best friend Patroclus. The scene of revenge, however, comes not from the Iliad, but from Book 22 of the Odyssey. In the Iliad, the two great rivals face one another in single combat. Hector, the defender of the home, against Achilles, who once sought glory, and now seeks only revenge. In Unforgiven, Money walks into the crowded bar alone as Odysseus appears before the reveling suitors. Odysseus kills Antinous, chief of the suitors, who is not expecting a fight and is caught off guard while drinking. The other suitors denounce the man they think is a clumsy beggar. Odysseus then announces his true identity and begins to slaughter them. They are unarmed, though eventually some of them lay hands on weapons. By the end, all are slain except for the bard, who will sing to future generations of Odysseus's great feat. So, Eastwood's William Money walks into the bar and asks for the barkeep who hung his friend up for public mockery. He then shoots him dead on the spot. Little Bill responds with disgust. You dirty coward, you shot an unarmed man. Well, says the impassive Eastwood, he should have armed himself if he's going to decorate his saloon with my friend. And he begins to kill the denizens of the bar. Soon all who have not run away are dead, except for a cowardly writer of westerns and the wounded Little Bill. As Eastwood stands over him, Hackman protests, I don't deserve this, to die like this. I was building a house. Money replies, deserves got nothing to do with it. The downed epic hero, Patroclus before Hector, Hector before Achilles, predicts the death of his victorious foe. Ned had told Little Bill that Money would come for him, as he did. And now Little Bill screams, I'll see you in hell, William Money. Eastwood grunts a derisive, yeah, and shoots Hackman at point-blank range. The nearly hysterical writer questions the victorious Money on his strategy. there was none. Money had killed in berserker rage. The writer determines to tell a story that will satisfy his customers, like the newspaper man in Liberty Valance. After taking another drink, Eastwood threatens the town if they do not bury his friend, and rides away. The demoralized town is too terrified to shoot at him. At the end of the movie, we hear a rumor that money is left for him. He moved his family to San Francisco, where he runs a successful dry goods store. His wife's mother comes to visit her daughter's grave, but cannot understand why a good woman would marry such a violent man. The credits roll by, ending with the movie's dedication to Sergio Leone and Don Siegel. Unforgiven is about more than mere money and the meaningless violence that punctuates his life. It is the tragic tale of Little Bill, who did his job to create order in a world of violent men and women, and then, in one moment of frustration and rage, went too far and killed an innocent man. Tacitus notes near the start of his great histories, the gods care more for our punishment than our reward. In the remorseless world we live in, the criminal is always allowed another chance. The good guy must not make a mistake. When Gene Hackman's Little Bill killed Morgan Freeman's Ned, he reenacted the end of the movie, for which Hackman won his first Oscar, The French Connection. There, after successfully frustrating violence and drug dealers, Hackman's Popeye Doyle goes too far and kills a fellow officer, while the criminal mastermind he was hunting escapes. Tragedy, as Aristotle saw it, is the story not of the success of the good or the punishment of the bad, but the fate that meets the good man who makes a mistake, hamartia. In the end, it's not the two murdered cowboys who are the unforgiven of the title. It's Little Bill. In Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, the American movie achieves tragedy. In the typical Hollywood movie, the good are rewarded and the evil punished. That's what we mean by fiction, as Oscar Wilde noted. It's also why men think they act. Little Bill's angry protest shows, "I don't deserve this." After the brutal murder of the two cowboys, Eastwood's youthful accomplice tries to console himself. "Well, I guess they had it coming." "Kid," Money replies, "we all got it coming." Just as he tells Little Bill, deserves got nothing to do with it. And just as Hamlet tells Polonius, treat every man after his deserts, and who should escape whipping. Fate obeys its own inexorable laws, and the efforts of critics to discover Oedipus's tragic flaw are as futile as the moralizing of Job's friends. Newspapers, and most movies, exist to hide this bleak but clear-sighted vision from our eyes. The Enlightenment Project believes that social justice can trump fate. The classics teach the opposite. Whatever will turn out to work for a society, the latter has provided the basis, and only the latter, for much great art. It is, I suppose, a logical possibility that meaningful art could be created on a foundation other than the genres and story patterns inherited from the classical past. We've been trying to do so for some time now. Even building on that legacy is no guarantee of success. Certainly few in the entertainment industry want to hear that true creativity can come only after a long discipline of learning old and complex traditions and subjecting those traditions to critical reflection. Even then, the intellectual challenge must be restrained by moral discipline, of humility before past accomplishment, of scorn for short-term sensual pleasure, of admiration for those who subordinate self to create a larger good for their society. George Bailey's Savings and Loan, It's a Wonderful Life, The Barn Building You Witness, The Lion King's Circle of Life. Ars gratia artis, that was the motto the MGM Lion roared through. Well, potius pecuniae gratia, we've tried art for art's sake and art for money's sake. Only creating within the tradition can teach us to subordinate those necessary aspects of life, artistry and money, to the wider perspectives, to the moral, intellectual disciplines which have given us the great art we need. With such perspectives and disciplines, we can still on occasion produce works of creative genius. Indeed, it's the best hope for the future of such creativity. The imperative of this book is the return to tradition, the great tradition of the classics with which we must never lose touch, and all the little traditions we love and are meant to love, though in the end we shall see them disappear, like the old Episcopalian prayer book and celebrating George Washington's birthday and wishing one another Merry Christmas. In our age, it's only the inconsistency we live off of that's kept us from silencing every tradition, as the German philosopher Gerhard Krüger put it. That inconsistency, however, is rooted in healthy instincts. We are called to be disciples, not energumens, Albert J. Nock wrote. The great tradition will go on because the forces of nature are on its side. It's the element in which we live and prosper and create. It's our goldfish bowl. Few of us are chosen to be leaders, but all of us are chosen at some point in our lives to perform certain acts and say certain words. The words will usually be ones we ourselves have not composed. At the end of Play It Again, Sam, Woody Allen's Alan Felix goes to the airport with Diane Keaton as she thinks to tell her husband, Tony Roberts, that she's leaving him. Instead, Woody tells her to get on the plane with her husband. He explains, you're part of his work, the thing that keeps him going. If that plane leaves the ground and you're not with him, you'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, and for the rest of your life. Flabbergasted, Keaton says, that's the most beautiful thing I ever heard. And Woody answers, it's from Casablanca. I've been waiting my whole life to say it. Audiences always laugh at that scene, but it has a serious message. Even in a comic vision of the world, the truly moral act doesn't come from a spontaneous movement of an untutored soul or an impulse from a vernal wood. It comes from having memorized the words and saying them at the right time. Few of us will ever be leaders, but we can still be Alan Felix. We just have to know our part. When our cue comes, may we know our lines and say them clearly. Thank you.
In your book, Dr. Koff, do you propose any remedies where we might find our way back to a creative engagement with the past?
There are a couple of ways. One is to wander through a good bookstore and find the books from the past that are still bestsellers. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are still bestsellers even today after all this time. Still a way for publishers to make money. I also think it's important that we start getting more mathematics and language into elementary schools. Elementary school kids learn languages very easily, and we have a clever scheme whereby we keep languages from them till they reach puberty. Now, puberty has so many terrible things involved with it that you can't really say it very briefly, but one of them is you don't learn languages so easily anymore. That's probably one that doesn't bother most people when they have teenagers, but if we would put more language along with more math into our elementary schools, I also think that Sunday schools would be a great place to get people some of the words. You can't teach them a whole language then, but granted all the coloring and singing that goes on, we've seen from Sesame Street how easy it is to teach kids an alphabet. And it doesn't have to be a concentrated. The Greek alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, these are all things that could be taught to kids in Sunday school, and what they then went on to do with them, learning a few words, learning a few sentences, could, I think, be the beginning of the path. So, a few suggestions. Most of us are mature rather than in elementary school, so it may be a discouraging idea. Even for them, however, there are loads of different ways to get into language, and it can be slow as well as positive.
At what point and how do you sensitize people to the other cultures if you're going to just teach them a Western thought?
The great thing about knowing, what I think most people find is the easiest way to get along with other people is when you're confident about yourself. It's precisely shy people who find it hard to meet other people. Someone who knows about his own culture is in a great position then to see the connections with other cultures. And some of the other cultures in the world have many connections with us. Islamic is the most obvious. There's just a lot of common ground there. But until you know your own, you're not likely to be able to respond to another culture in a way that both respects what they are, sees the commonality, and then also has a genuine tolerance for real differences as opposed to incidental differences. Some cultures are very, very different from our own and very hard to assimilate. Others are much closer. But without a knowledge of your own, you're unlikely to be able to respond well. I will say another thing. Even in the cases where we respond well, it'll always be in a comparative way. That is, we'll always be responding to this book we liked, this piece of art we liked. To really know another culture, you need to immerse yourself in it. And nobody in colleges is suggesting that. What they're offering them are survey courses on other cultures. And indeed, even the suggestion that there be a real attempt at immersion, which involves learning their languages, is usually met by the administrators with absolute horror, because the two hardest parts of the curriculum, the two parts that always cause students to get low grades, are mathematics and foreign languages. And administrators do not want to hear about a silly idea which would cause students to spend even another year there, along with the 5 years they're now spending in college. What they want is a nice survey that will satisfy. And the answer is, the survey is useful for a person who really knows his own culture well. And that person can then respond to the survey. But for a person who doesn't know any culture, what you have is a confused mishmash. And unfortunately, many college curricula, if it's fair to even call them curricula, are precisely that. You don't really get enough of anything to know about it. In the short term, our society is so strong that we still see kids going on to jobs and some degree of performance. In the long run, I think this can't end well, as each generation knows slightly less of the foundations that are needed to be productive in your own society. Most people who come from different cultures still want modern technology, which is based on modern science, and they want some form of self-rule, whether they call it democracy or not. And those are three traditions that come from the West. Now, the dilemma that faces the people with incredibly rich traditions, like India, China, Japan, is how do you get the benefits of these Western traditions and not lose what you are? And let other people judge how successful they've been. Most people think the Japanese have been pretty successful in maintaining key elements of their own society and yet being able to get advantages of ours. If the cars we drive around, the TV sets we watch are any indication. We see both India and China now attempting to do that. And India is developing a fantastic computer industry in response to us. And the Chinese seem to have a wonderful aerospace industry, which some people seem to think has been strongly influenced by the United States, if one may say so. The challenge that now faces, that's stolen lock, stock, and barrel is a crude way to describe it, but still, at least certainly influenced. The challenge they face of the challenge that the Japanese have faced and answered so interestingly, which is, how do you get some advantages? How do you get the Western computer industry and still maintain your own traditions? And it isn't clear what's going to happen. The challenge we face is understanding that we're not going to help the rest of the world by giving away the basis of what makes us so attractive to the world. What we need is to have a deeper knowledge of our traditions so that our traditions will continue to be productive in a way that will be of interest to other countries and cultures, we hope, and to know enough about those cultures so that we can respond to them. But no American that I know has any interest in developing the traditions of China or the traditions of India to create a creative culture in those societies. And in their own way, they have chosen to go after ours. That's fine. But we're not going to help them by losing our traditions. We're the ones with the direct contact, and we're the ones who need to maintain that contact, and that's only done by work. That's by hard work. That's sort of the bad news, which college administrators are not interested in hearing. They want to hear, how do you have an interesting and amusing course, which doesn't challenge people very much, but does amuse them and entertain them, and then they can go out and get a job. And the answer is, the really good jobs belong to people who are part of the Western tradition. And that has been true throughout the history of both democracy and of science. Copernicus knew his Ptolemy backwards. Galileo knew his Plato very well. Heisenberg knew his Greek excellently. Schrödinger wrote a book on the Greeks. And that's the tradition of ancient science. If you look at the great traditions of Western democracy, you'll see Machiavelli not only wrote The Prince, he wrote a book on the first 10 books of Livy. Some of us think the crucial work for him. Jefferson and Adams knew their Greek and Latin. John Stuart Mill, when he was made the honorary president of St. Andrews, gave a lecture on what the college curriculum should be. And if we were to read it, I would be in danger of being accused of plagiarism, because his answer was Greek and Latin and mathematics and science. That's what it needs to be. Now, these were not conservatives. These were not people trying to cling to the past, certainly not John Stuart Mill and Thomas Jefferson. They were people who understood that what is most creative in our society comes from the past, and we need to be in touch with the beginning if we're going to contribute to the end. Does that make sense? Does that over-respond to what you asked? There's either total agreement or sullen discontent from the other.
I do have one. Sitting here in a bookstore, what books are good for us to, I guess, a good introduction to learning Latin, or at least having of course not learning it, but at least having an introduction to it?
A very fun Englishman named Peter Jones, who's written some technical textbooks for Greek and Latin, has two fun little books. One's called Learning Latin, the other's called Learning Ancient Greek. And they're now available in America. And what they are is he originally put them in the English newspaper The Telegraph as a weekly challenge to see if people could learn Latin and then Greek just reading the newspaper. And they are not meant to be more than an introduction, but they're a terrific introduction. The fact is that learning any language is a challenge, and Greek and Latin, along with, by the way, Russian and German, there are others that are also hard, is a real challenge. And Jones's books are a wonderful way to get basic feeling for the language, a few wonderful short passages. You do the Latin, you eventually get a De Fideles, and you'll get a couple of poems of Catullus. It's a nice, beautiful two-line poem of Catullus, Odi et Amo, which even by the halfway through the book, he's teaching you to read it, which is so powerful and so effective. I think anyone who read it would want to go on and learn more Latin. And on the Greek side, he does more or less the same. It is only an introduction, and after you work through his books, you then need to go somewhere and really learn some grammar and really work on things. But again, by the time you're halfway through his Greek thing, you're reading the beginning of John's Gospel, shorter passages from Platonic dialogues, things that show you that it doesn't take forever to get to a situation where you can learn something. And when it works, I think, really causes people to want to go on. As I say, one of the funny things about the way the human is hardwired is that you learn languages easier at the beginning. So it would be great if we could get a little bit more language into elementary schools. But we're all hardwired to learn language. And one of the fun things about both Greek and Latin is that as you learn it, you start seeing all this English popping up. And there's a very fun program for elementary school kids developed originally in the Philadelphia system called Language Arts Through Latin, which is, in fact, as presented, a English vocabulary course. But that is really a disguise. It's really a Latin course. And the fellow who developed it, Rudolf Maschantonio, snuck it through the board as a way to improve people's English, which it had fantastic success in doing. It also had fantastic success in awakening teachers who were bored or frustrated, because it's fun to teach people something real. And very often we're stuck in a situation where we're entertaining, where we're giving tests, where we're doing all kinds of things that aren't really teaching. And language is something where you can see students learn something and start using it right away. Especially with Greek and Latin, where the relations to our own language are everywhere, from relatively simple words, but especially the more and more seriously you read. Everyone knows for law and medicine how useful it is. But the fact is, even if you just read the editorials in the New York Times, which I don't necessarily recommend you do, but you can do it for this purpose, you see that the heart of what's there, again and again, is said using a Greek or Latin word. That's why they say, well, it's a dead language, but we're still speaking it. If we're going to talk about law and science and morality and technology, we've got to speak Greek and Latin. It happens to be the most efficient way to do it is to learn Greek and Latin. There's a famous story of Winston Churchill telling people he wasn't very good in Latin, so he had to study English over and over again, and how lucky he was. Churchill's favorite book was Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Anyone who's ever tried to read that book will know right away it's easier to learn Latin first and then read Gibbon. And if we had a graduation test from high school that involved a test in Gibbon, Latin would be all over the place because it's easier. If you're going to read Gibbon, it's easier to learn Latin and then read Gibbon than to try and start off with an ordinary English vocabulary. You spend as much time looking up words as you do reading Cicero or Virgil.
Thanks everyone for coming. Today Dr. Kopp will be available to sign books and we'll talk to you as well.
Thank you very much.